On the morning of October 15, 2015, the police received a call from a young guy. In tears, barely able to find his words, he said he found his neighbor dead, shot in the right side of his body. Martin had always been the kind of neighbor everyone wished they had. At 42 years old, he was reliable, decent, and always willing to lend a hand. With a strong build and a calm demeanor, Martin exuded a quiet confidence that made people trust him instantly. He lived alone in a modest, well-kept house at the end of the cul-de-sac, directly across from Mrs. Smith and her 22-year-old son, Michael. Martin had moved into the neighborhood about 6 years ago, and ever since, he had become an integral part of the community, especially for the Smiths. Mrs. Smith, also 42, was a widow who had been raising Michael on her own since her husband's untimely death a few years ago. She was a kind and hard-working woman, always busy with one thing or another, but she had never quite managed to fill the void left by her late husband. The Smiths' home had always been a bit lonely, with Michael being her only companion, but Martin's arrival in the neighborhood brought a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. He was always there to help with household tasks that required a bit more strength or expertise, from fixing leaky faucets to helping with yard work. Over time, Mrs. Smith had grown to see him as more than just a neighbor. He was a reliable friend. Michael, on the other hand, had always been a bit of an enigma to those around him. At 22, he was quiet, reserved, and kept mostly to himself. His striking features, a slim frame, sharp jawline, and dark, thoughtful eyes, drew attention, but he didn't seem to care much for it. He had a deep love for cars, particularly classic models, a passion he had inherited from his father. This interest had initially been a solitary hobby until Martin moved in with his own love for automobiles. When Martin bought a stunning Ford Mustang, it became a common sight to see Michael frequently visiting Martin's garage, often staying late into the night as they tinkered with the engine or discussed the finer points of car restoration. Martin had noticed Michael's fascination with cars early on and had been more than happy to share his own knowledge and experience. They quickly bonded over this shared interest, and what started as casual conversations turned into long, deep discussions about life, dreams, and everything in between. Martin found Michael to be an intelligent young man with a sharp wit and a keen eye for detail. He enjoyed the younger man's company and began to look forward to their garage sessions, as much as Michael did. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a typical mentor-student relationship, an older man guiding a younger one, perhaps even filling the role of a father figure that Michael had missed out on. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken connection growing between them, something neither of them fully understood at first. Martin, despite his usually composed nature, found himself drawn to Michael in a way that was new and unexpected. It wasn't just the cars that brought them together. There was an undeniable chemistry between them that neither could ignore. Martin and Michael's bond grew stronger. They spent more and more time together, not just in the garage, but also grabbing coffee or taking long drives in the Mustang, where their conversations became even more personal. There was a comfort in their companionship, a mutual understanding that transcended words. For Michael, who had always felt a bit isolated, this relationship with Martin was something special. He admired the older man, respected him, and found himself looking forward to every moment they spent together. Mrs. Smith had always seen Martin as the ideal neighbor, a man who was not only dependable, but also genuinely kind. After losing her husband, she had struggled to manage everything on her own. But Martin's arrival in the neighborhood had brought her some much-needed relief. Over the years, he had become a constant presence in her life, always ready to help with the heavier tasks around the house or to offer a friendly ear when she needed to talk. Whether it was fixing a broken fence, mowing the lawn, or simply carrying heavy groceries from the car, Martin was there without hesitation. Despite their close relationship, there was something about Martin that Mrs. Smith found puzzling. He was undoubtedly attractive, with his strong, rugged features and a quiet, masculine charm that many women would have noticed. And yet, he never seemed to show any interest in her as a woman. Mrs. Smith wasn't one to push the boundaries of their friendship, but she had occasionally found herself wondering if there might be something more between them. After all, she was still an attractive woman in her own right. tall with soft curves and a warm smile that had once captivated her late husband. But Martin had never given her any indication that he saw her as anything other than a neighbor and a friend. She had even thought that perhaps he was just being respectful, not wanting to cross any lines given her status as a widow. Still, there were times when she caught herself daydreaming about what it might be like if Martin did see her that way. But those thoughts were fleeting, as Martin remained consistently neutral, always polite, always kind, but never flirtatious. Mrs. Smith also observed how Martin had taken a particular interest in her son, Michael. She was grateful for this, believing that Martin was providing a fatherly influence that Michael had sorely missed since his own father passed away. Martin and Michael's shared love for cars seemed like the perfect bridge between them, and she was happy to see her son spending time with someone she trusted. It was clear to her that Michael looked up to Martin. He spoke of him often and seemed to enjoy their time together in the garage. But as much as Mrs. Smith was pleased with this blossoming friendship, she couldn't ignore certain signs that troubled her. For one, she had long suspected that Michael might be gay. He had never brought a girl home, never talked about any romantic interests, and often kept his personal life very private. While she had tried to broach the subject gently in the past, Michael had always deflected, preferring to keep such matters to himself. As a mother, she loved her son unconditionally and was prepared to accept him no matter what, but she couldn't help but worry about the challenges he might face if he chose to come out. She had never directly confronted him about it, preferring to let him share in his own time, but her instincts told her that Michael was struggling with his identity. She had hoped that maybe, if he found a strong role model like Martin, he might feel more comfortable opening up about who he really was. As Martin and Michael spent more and more time together, Mrs. Smith began to notice subtle changes in her son's behavior. He seemed happier, more animated, and there was a newfound confidence in him that she hadn't seen before. She initially chalked it up to the positive influence Martin was having on him, but a small, nagging doubt began to creep into her mind. Could there be more to their relationship than just friendship? She quickly dismissed the thought as paranoid. Martin was a good man, a decent man, and he would never take advantage of Michael in any way. He was simply filling a void in Michael's life, helping him in ways that she, as his mother, could not. The bond between Martin and Michael deepened, transforming into something neither had anticipated. Their initial connection, forged over a shared love of cars, had grown into a complex relationship filled with unspoken emotions and a profound sense of trust. The Mustang project in Martin's garage became their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the world and simply be themselves. Michael, who had always kept his thoughts and feelings closely guarded, found himself slowly opening up to Martin in ways he never had with anyone else. There was a sense of safety in Martin's presence, a quiet understanding that allowed Michael to let down his walls. As they spent more time together, Michael began to grapple with the emotions that had long been buried within him. He had always known he was different, that his attraction didn't align with what was expected of him, but he had never dared to voice these feelings out loud, not to his mother, not to his friends, not to anyone. But with Martin, things felt different. There was something about the way Martin listened, the way he made Michael feel seen and understood, that gave Michael the courage to confront his own identity. Late one evening, after hours of working together in the garage, Michael finally acknowledged to himself what he had known for so long. He was gay. It was a truth that had been buried under layers of fear and denial, but in the quiet company of Martin, it became undeniable. As Michael wrestled with his thoughts, he began to notice subtle changes in Martin as well. There was a quiet intensity in the way Martin looked at him, an unspoken connection that went beyond friendship. Martin's casual touches, a hand on the shoulder, a reassuring pat on the back, began to carry a different weight, a warmth that lingered longer than usual. Michael could feel the tension building between them, an invisible thread pulling them closer together. The more they confided in each other, the more their relationship evolved. What had once been a simple friendship now carried an undercurrent of something more profound, something that neither of them could ignore. The tension between them reached a tipping point one night when, after spending hours together in the garage, they found themselves standing close, too close, without the usual buffer of space that had kept their emotions in check. In that moment, The barriers between them crumbled. What began as a tentative touch escalated into something more intimate, more electric. The first brush of lips, hesitant and unsure, quickly gave way to a passionate embrace as years of suppressed emotions erupted between them. As the relationship between Martin and Michael deepened, subtle changes in Michael's behavior began to catch Mrs. Smith's attention. Being a protective and attentive mother, she had always been closely attuned to her son's moods and habits, and lately, something about him seemed different. Michael, who had always been more of a homebody, started spending increasing amounts of time away from the house, often with Martin. What had once been a few hours tinkering with cars in the garage had turned into late nights out, and Michael was growing more secretive about his whereabouts. Initially, Mrs. Smith dismissed her concerns as the natural course of a young man finding his independence. She rationalized that Martin's influence was helping Michael come out of his shell, that this was just a part of him growing up and building relationships outside of their small family unit. Martin had always been a steady presence in their lives, someone she trusted implicitly. After all, he had been like a father figure to Michael, filling the void left by her late husband. Mrs. Smith found comfort in the thought that Martin was guiding her son in ways she couldn't. However, as time passed, Mrs. Smith couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He seemed distracted, often lost in thought, and there was an emotional distance between them that hadn't been there before. He no longer shared details of his day with her as he once had, and when she asked him where he had been or what he had been up to, his answers were vague and evasive. One day, as Mrs. Smith was tidying up the living room, she noticed Michael's phone on the coffee table, buzzing with a new message. She didn't usually intrude on his privacy, but something compelled her to take a look this time. Picking up the phone, she saw a text from Martin flash across the screen. The message was simple but intimate, referencing a meeting later that evening and alluding to a connection between them that was unmistakably more than just friendship. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the conversation, her hands trembling. The messages were filled with affectionate exchanges, hints of their deepening bond, and references to moments of intimacy that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Mrs. Smith felt a wave of emotions crash over her: shock, confusion, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. The realization that Martin, the man she had trusted so completely, was involved in an affair with her son was more than she could bear. Unable to contain her feelings, Mrs. Smith waited until Michael returned home that evening. The moment he walked through the door, she confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and fury. The confrontation was intense, the air between them charged with tension as she demanded answers. She accused Martin of taking advantage of Michael, of betraying the trust she had placed in him, and of manipulating her son into a relationship that, in her mind, was completely inappropriate. Michael, caught off guard by his mother's outburst, tried to defend his relationship with Martin. He insisted that what they had was mutual, that Martin had done nothing to harm him, and that he had entered into the relationship of his own free will. But Mrs. Smith was too distraught to listen. She was overwhelmed by the idea that Martin, whom she had secretly admired, had chosen her son over her, and worse, that her son had been drawn into something she couldn't control or protect him from. As the argument escalated, Mrs. Smith's emotions boiled over. She ordered Michael to end the relationship immediately, demanding that he stay away from Martin. She was adamant that this could not continue, that it was wrong on so many levels, and that it had to stop for Michael's own good. Despite Michael's protests, Mrs. Smith was firm in her decision. Martin was never to come near her son again. The tension in the Smith household was palpable in the days following the confrontation. Michael and his mother barely spoke, the once warm and open relationship now clouded by distrust and resentment. Mrs. Smith, steadfast in her resolve, had forbidden Michael from seeing Martin, believing she was acting in his best interest. She was convinced that severing this connection was the only way to protect her son from further harm, even if it meant causing him pain in the short term. Michael, on the other hand, felt torn apart. He loved his mother dearly and understood her concerns, but he couldn't just turn off his feelings for Martin. The bond they had formed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, and despite his mother's disapproval, He couldn't bring himself to walk away from it. His emotions were in turmoil, caught between his loyalty to his mother and the deep connection he shared with Martin. The quarrel between mother and son grew more heated with each passing day. Mrs. Smith pressed Michael to break off all contact with Martin, while Michael became increasingly defensive, retreating further into himself. He spent long hours in his room, brooding over the situation, unsure of what to do. The once peaceful home was now filled with an unbearable tension, with every conversation between them turning into an argument. Mrs. Smith couldn't understand why Michael was so adamant about maintaining the relationship, and Michael couldn't find the words to make her understand the depth of his feelings. One afternoon, after yet another heated argument, Michael stormed out of the house, needing some space to clear his head. Mrs. Smith watched him go, her heart heavy with worry. She feared she was losing him, that the more she pushed, the further away he would drift. But she was resolute. She couldn't allow this relationship to continue. Later that day, as Mrs. Smith returned from running errands, she drove down their street and noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. 2 blocks from their house, she spotted Martin's old Mustang parked by the curb. She slowed down, her eyes narrowing as she saw Michael sitting in the passenger seat. Martin was behind the wheel, leaning in close to Michael as they talked, their heads almost touching. The sight of them together sent a jolt of anger through her. They were blatantly disregarding her wishes, meeting in secret despite her clear instructions. Mrs. Smith felt a surge of betrayal and helplessness wash over her. She had tried to protect Michael, to shield him from what she believed was an unhealthy influence, but here he was openly defying her. She pulled her car to the side of the road and got out, her steps quick and determined as she approached the Mustang. The sound of her heels on the pavement caught Michael's attention, and he looked up, his face paling as he saw his mother approaching. Martin turned to see her too, his expression unreadable. Without hesitation, Mrs. Smith demanded that Michael get out of the car. Her voice was sharp, laced with a mixture of anger and desperation. Michael hesitated, torn between his mother's command and his desire to stay with Martin. The tension was thick as the 3 of them stood there, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. "I told you to stay away from him." Mrs. Smith's voice cracked as she spoke, the pain evident in her tone. She couldn't understand why Michael was putting her through this, why he was so insistent on maintaining this relationship that was tearing their family apart. But Michael didn't move. Instead, he looked at his mother with a mixture of defiance and sadness. He didn't want to hurt her, but he also couldn't deny the bond he had with Martin. It was more than just a fling, more than just a friendship. It was something he had never felt before, something real and powerful. Martin, sensing the conflict between mother and son, spoke up in a calm, measured tone, trying to ease the tension. He explained that he would never harm Michael and that their relationship was built on mutual respect and affection. But Mrs. Smith was too emotional, too caught up in her own fears and protective instincts to listen. She only saw a man who had overstepped his boundaries, who had taken advantage of her son's vulnerabilities. She issued one final command to Michael: "Get out of that car and come home with me, or don't come home at all." The ultimatum hung in the air, a painful choice that Michael wasn't ready to make. But the look in his mother's eyes told him that she meant every word. Slowly, reluctantly, Michael opened the car door and stepped out, his movements heavy with the weight of the decision he was making. He didn't look at Martin as he walked away, the sting of his mother's words still fresh in his mind. Michael's demeanor had shifted in ways that worried her. He was quieter, more subdued, his usual spark gone. He spent most of his time in his room, avoiding eye contact and giving only brief, curt responses when spoken to. Mrs. Smith could sense the pain and confusion in her son, but she didn't know how to reach him. Her protective instincts had led her to push Martin out of his life, but now she questioned if she had made the right choice. She felt lost, unsure of how to repair the growing rift between them. Then, one fateful day, everything changed. Michael, still reeling from the confrontation with his mother, decided to visit Martin's house. He knew he had to be careful. His mother's anger was still fresh in his mind, but he couldn't stay away. Despite her ultimatum, Michael felt compelled to see Martin, to explain what had happened, and to seek comfort in the only person who truly understood him. He planned to sneak out while his mother was at work, hoping to keep the visit a secret. That afternoon, as Mrs. Smith was busy at her job, Michael slipped out of the house and made his way to Martin's. The walk felt longer than usual, each step filled with anxiety and anticipation. When he arrived at Martin's home, something felt off. The house was eerily quiet, the garage door shut tight. There was no sign of the Mustang or any indication that Martin was home, but Michael had a nagging feeling that he needed to go inside. He tried the front door, finding it unlocked, and entered the house cautiously. The silence was unnerving, the air heavy with a strange tension. As he walked through the hallway, calling Martin's name, dread began to settle in his stomach. He made his way toward the living room, where the sight that greeted him would be forever etched in his mind. Martin was lying on the floor, motionless, a pool of blood spreading around him. Michael's heart raced, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He rushed to Martin's side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse, but there was none. Martin's body was cold, lifeless, with a visible gunshot wound marring his chest. The horror of the scene paralyzed Michael, and for a moment, all he could do was stare, unable to believe what had happened. A wave of panic washed over him as the reality of the situation hit. Martin was dead, killed by a gunshot, and Michael was the one who had found him. His mind raced, trying to piece together what could have led to this, but nothing made sense. Who could have done this? Why would anyone want to hurt Martin? His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Finally, snapping out of his shock, Michael realized he needed to call the police. His hand shook as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's voice on the other end seemed distant, almost unreal, as Michael tried to explain what he had found. His voice cracked with emotion, barely able to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. After making the call, Michael ran from the house, desperate to get back to his mother. He didn't know where else to turn, his grief and fear overwhelming him. When he burst through the front door of their home, Mrs. Smith was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The sight of her son, pale and distraught, instantly sent her into a state of alarm. "Mom," Michael choked out, his voice trembling with fear and sorrow. "Martin, he's dead." Mrs. Smith dropped the knife she was holding, her face draining of color as she processed the words. She rushed to her son, her hands gripping his shoulders as if to steady him. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael, his eyes filled with tears, could barely speak as he recounted the horrible scene. Mrs. Smith's heart broke as she listened, her own tears welling up as the gravity of the situation sank in. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the anger and the arguments, she had never wished harm upon Martin. She had only wanted to protect her son, not drive Martin to his death. As Michael broke down in her arms, Mrs. Smith's own tears flowed freely. She held her son tightly, her mind reeling with guilt and grief. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. As the police arrived and began their investigation, Michael found himself spiraling into a deep depression. The shock of Martin's death, combined with the guilt of disobeying his mother and the overwhelming sense of loss, pushed him into a dark place. He withdrew even further into himself, the light in his eyes dimmed by the weight of his grief. As the investigation unfolded, detectives meticulously pieced together the timeline of events leading up to Martin's tragic demise. The initial autopsy report was chilling. Martin had been killed by a single gunshot wound, with the time of death estimated to be around 11:40 p.m. on October 15th. The detectives, determined to leave no stone unturned, arrived at the Smith home to question both Michael and his mother about that fateful night. Both mother and son struggled to recall anything unusual from that evening. Michael, still in a state of shock and grief, had been too preoccupied with the fallout from his argument with his mother to notice anything amiss. Mrs. Smith, similarly consumed by her own emotions, hadn't detected anything out of the ordinary either. The detectives took note of their responses, but their attention soon shifted to a more pressing discovery. The forensic team had determined that Martin had been shot with a Colt Cobra, a distinctive revolver with a notorious reputation for accuracy and power. When the detectives mentioned this detail, Michael felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. His thoughts turned to the old pistol that had been stored in the back of his father's closet for as long as he could remember. A Colt Cobra, an heirloom that had been passed down through the family. It was a relic of a bygone era, left untouched since his father's passing, or so he had thought. As these memories came rushing back, Michael felt a deep sense of dread. He had never paid much attention to the gun, but now it seemed to loom over everything, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Mrs. Smith, realizing the significance of her son's reaction, also began to feel a growing sense of alarm. The detectives' interest was piqued when they learned about the family's connection to a Colt Cobra. They immediately asked to see the weapon, and Mrs. Smith led them to the bedroom closet where it had been stored for years. With trembling hands, she unlocked the cabinet, only to be confronted by an empty space where the gun should have been. The realization that the Colt Cobra was missing struck her like a physical blow. The gun, which had been securely stored away, had somehow vanished without her noticing. The detectives, sensing the gravity of the situation, took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about the gun's last known whereabouts. Mrs. Smith, struggling to comprehend how it could have gone missing, could only offer vague, disjointed answers. The detectives left no detail unexamined, aware that this development could be a crucial breakthrough in their investigation. Later, the lead detective called Michael in for a more comprehensive questioning session. Michael, still reeling from the discovery, recounted the details of his relationship with Martin. Every word he spoke seemed to weigh heavily in the air, the emotional toll of Martin's death evident in his demeanor. The detectives listened closely, their keen eyes missing nothing, as they tried to piece together the motives and circumstances surrounding the case. With the new information in hand, the detectives expanded their search efforts, focusing on the possibility that the missing Colt Cobra had been discarded nearby. They organized teams to comb through trash bins and dumpsters in the vicinity, hoping to find any trace of the weapon. Hours of searching finally paid off when they found the missing Colt Cobra in a dumpster several blocks away. The gun was wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, hastily discarded among the refuse. It was immediately sent for forensic analysis, the detectives knowing that this could be the key piece of evidence they had been searching for. The recovery of the Colt Cobra marked a crucial development in the investigation, and forensic analysis of the weapon was the next vital step. The Colt Cobra, retrieved from a dumpster several blocks away, was sent to a crime lab where forensic experts began their meticulous examination. The forensic team first focused on confirming whether the revolver was the weapon used in Martin's death. The ballistics analysis compared the bullet found in Martin's body with the Colt Cobra to determine if they matched. The results confirmed that the revolver was indeed the firearm used in the shooting. This significant breakthrough further narrowed the scope of the investigation, providing concrete evidence linking the Colt Cobra to Martin's murder. However, the case was far from resolved. The detectives knew that identifying the weapon was only part of the puzzle. They needed to uncover who had fired it and why. The next phase of the investigation involved a deeper dive into the revolver's condition and any potential forensic evidence that might be present on it. The Colt Cobra was carefully examined for any physical evidence, such as fingerprints, DNA, or gunpowder residue. Despite thorough analysis, no usable fingerprints were found on the weapon. The absence of fingerprints complicated matters, as it suggested that the gun had been handled carefully or had been wiped clean. The lack of identifiable prints meant that the investigators needed to explore other avenues to determine who had been in possession of the Colt Cobra. The detectives then turned their attention to other possible sources of evidence. They obtained a search warrant for Mrs. Smith's clothing and personal items, suspecting that she might have had some contact with the Colt Cobra. The forensic team analyzed her clothing for any traces of gunpowder or blood. The results showed nothing incriminating. Her clothes had been laundered and showed no evidence of recent gunfire or contact with the weapon. During the search, a pair of shoes found in Mrs. Smith's closet drew attention. The shoes, though not immediately linked to the Colt Cobra, were subjected to further examination. Forensic experts discovered traces of gunpowder residue and evidence of shooting on the shoes, suggesting that they had been in close proximity to the revolver when it was fired. The presence of gunpowder indicated that someone wearing those shoes had recently handled or been near the Colt Cobra when it was discharged. The detectives noted this significant discovery, understanding that it pointed to someone in the household having direct contact with the weapon. Mrs. Smith's claim of not knowing how to handle the Colt Cobra and her assertion of not having seen it for years were contradicted by the forensic evidence found on the shoes. This discrepancy prompted the detectives to scrutinize her statements more closely. As the investigation continued, the detectives reviewed surveillance footage from various locations around the neighborhood. As the investigation into Martin's death deepened, the detectives turned their focus on Mrs. Smith, scrutinizing every aspect of her involvement. Initially, Mrs. Smith staunchly denied any connection to the Colt Cobra or Martin's death. Her statements remained consistent. She claimed that she had no knowledge of the weapon's whereabouts and had not handled it in any way. Despite the mounting evidence against her, including the gunpowder residue found on her shoes, Mrs. Smith's denials persisted. However, the detectives had a powerful piece of evidence in their possession: surveillance footage from a camera installed across the street from the Smith residence. This footage had captured the movements of individuals around the time of the shooting, and it proved to be a crucial element in unraveling the case. The recording showed a person, later identified as Mrs. Smith, leaving the house at precisely 11:20 p.m. The footage then depicted her returning to the house in a hurry at 11:44 p.m. The timestamps clearly indicated that she had been away from the house for about 24 minutes, a period that corresponded closely with the estimated time of Martin's death. Presented with the surveillance footage, Mrs. Smith could no longer maintain her earlier denials. The visual evidence left her with no room to dispute the facts. Faced with the undeniable proof of her departure and return, she finally admitted to having been involved in the tragic incident. Mrs. Smith explained that her intentions had not been to harm Martin. In a fit of anger and frustration, she had planned to confront him and intimidate him into ending his relationship with Michael. Armed with the Colt Cobra, she intended to use it merely as a means of scaring Martin, believing that the threat of the weapon would be enough to compel him to comply with her demands. The thought of actually using the gun never crossed her mind, and she had no intention of causing him any physical harm. The confrontation unfolded differently than she had anticipated. When Mrs. Smith arrived at Martin's garage, she found him in a state of calm, trying to talk her down. Despite her intentions to scare him, the situation escalated. Martin attempted to calm Mrs. Smith and take the gun from her, but his approach was perceived as overly forceful and alarming. In the heat of the moment, Mrs. Smith accidentally pulled the trigger. The shot fired, and though the bullet was only a few centimeters away from Martin's heart, it struck him on his side, severely damaging his liver. The injury was fatal. Martin's death was almost instantaneous due to the severe internal damage caused by the bullet. The unintended nature of the shooting and the tragic outcome were a result of the volatile circumstances rather than a premeditated act of violence. Mrs. Smith's confession, coupled with the forensic evidence and surveillance footage, provided a comprehensive picture of the events leading up to Martin's death. The combination of these elements revealed that the shooting was a tragic accident resulting from a heated confrontation rather than a deliberate act of malice. In the aftermath of her confession, Mrs. Smith was formally charged with manslaughter. Manslaughter, a serious offense, is defined as the unlawful killing of another person without premeditation or intent to kill, often resulting from reckless or negligent behavior. In Mrs. Smith's case, the charge was rooted in her careless handling of the Colt Cobra, which led to Martin's death. The legal proceedings began with Mrs. Smith's arraignment, where she faced the formal charges in court. The prosecution presented the case against her, highlighting the key aspects of the incident: her intent to scare Martin, her lack of intention to actually harm him, and the subsequent tragic outcome. The prosecution argued that Mrs. Smith's reckless use of the firearm, despite not intending to cause harm, demonstrated a gross negligence that warranted legal accountability. Ultimately, the court found Mrs. Smith guilty of manslaughter due to her reckless handling of the Colt Cobra. The verdict reflected the serious consequences of her actions, acknowledging that while there was no intent to kill, her negligence in handling the firearm directly led to Martin's death. Sentencing followed, with the court imposing a prison term that balanced justice for the victim with consideration for Mrs. Smith's emotional state and lack of prior criminal history. 6 years of the prison. Michael was devastated. Within a few days, he lost two of the people most dear to him. Michael's further history is unknown, but let's wish him strength to cope with this grief.